All right, today we're going to go on a pretty fascinating genetic journey. We're going to start with a really simple question about something you see every day, your height. And we're going to trace the answer all the way down to the tiny little typos in your DNA that, well, make you you.
So, have you ever stopped to think about why people aren't just short or tall? Like an on off switch? Instead, we see this incredible, continuous spectrum of heights. Well, it turns out the answer is written deep, deep inside our genetic code. And that very question, it drops us right into a field called quantitative genetics. This is the science that goes way beyond simple yes or no traits. It helps us understand the genetics of things you can actually measure, the more or less traits that really define so much of who we are. Okay, so here's the key thing to get. There is no single height gene. Nope. Instead, your final height is the result of something called polygenic inheritance. Just imagine hundreds of different genes, and each one is contributing just a tiny amount, like a little pinch of salt to the final recipe. Some add a bit of height, some might take a little away, and that combination is what creates the whole spectrum we see. Now, if there are so many genes involved, that brings up a pretty big question, right? How on earth do scientists figure out how much of a trait like height is actually because of genetics versus, your environment or what you eat? The key concept here is called heritability, and honestly, it's one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of genetics. So when you hear a scientist say height is about 80% heritable, they do not mean that 80% of your personal height comes from your genes. What it really means is that about 80% of the differences in height across a whole population, the reason some of us are taller or shorter than others, is because of genetic differences. It's always about the group, not the individual. Super important distinction. And scientists get even more specific with this idea to make some really powerful predictions. By zeroing in on just the genetic effects that get reliably passed down from parent to child, they can actually forecast how traits will change over generations. I mean, this is the exact tool that lets agricultural scientists breed taller corn or helps farmers select for more productive cows. It's pretty amazing stuff. And this chart just lays it all out perfectly. Any trait you can see is basically a product of two major things: the genetic variance we've been talking about and environmental variance. And it's everything else, from your nutrition as a kid to the climate you live in. It's always nature and nurture working together. So how do scientists actually hunt down these specific genes when they're scattered all across our massive genome? Well, they use this incredible technique called QTL mapping. Think of it like this. If your genome is a giant map, QTL mapping uses specific landmarks, these known genetic markers, to flag the general neighborhoods on your chromosomes that are linked to a trait. It's basically a genetic GPS that tells them where to look. Okay, so we've seen how all these genes can work together. But that just leads to a deeper question, doesn't it? Where did the variation in those genes come from in the first place? To answer that, we have to zoom in, way, way in, from the level of the gene down to the individual letters of the DNA code itself. And the answer, in a single word, is mutation. A mutation is just a permanent change in the DNA sequence. The best way to think about it is like a typo in the gigantic instruction manual that is your genome. And these typos, they are the raw material for evolution. They are the ultimate source of all new genetic traits, period. These typos can pop up in two main ways. Spontaneous mutations are just natural errors. They just happen when your cells are copying trillions of letters of DNA. But mutations can also be induced or caused by outside forces, and we call those forces mutagens. And you've definitely heard of some of these. UV radiation from the sun. Yep, that's exactly why we wear sunscreen. Medical X-rays. There are even certain chemicals that can sneak into our cells and pretend to be DNA building blocks, tricking our cellular machinery into making a mistake. All of these can crank up the rate of those genetic typos. So what actually happens when a mutation occurs? What are the real-world consequences? Well, this is where it gets really interesting, because it turns out not all typos are created equal. Not at all. Their effects can be wildly different. Let's look at a really disruptive one called a frame shift mutation. See, your cells read your DNA in three-letter words. Now, look what happens if you insert or delete just one single letter. It shifts the entire reading frame. All of a sudden, the simple sentence, "the cat ate the rat," becomes absolute gibberish from that typo onward. For a gene trying to build a vital protein, an error like this can be a total disaster.
And these mutations can lead to a whole range of outcomes. Some are devastatingly simple. A lethal mutation is just a fatal flaw in the blueprint. Others are more subtle, like a conditional mutation that only causes a problem under certain conditions, kind of like a car that only stalls when it's raining. And while a lot of mutations cause a loss of function, basically breaking a gene, sometimes they can actually create a gain of function, a random typo that accidentally unlocks a new or even more powerful ability for that gene. So why should we care so much about these tiny little typos? Because they are at the absolute heart of everything from genetic diseases like cancer to the way bacteria evolve to become resistant to our antibiotics. By really understanding how mutation works, we can better understand life itself and develop the tools we need to fight disease. And that leaves us with a final, kind of mind-blowing thought. If all this incredible genetic diversity, all of life, begins with a random typo, a biological accident, then how do these random events get shaped and organized by things like natural selection to build the stunning, ordered complexity that we see all around us? It's a question that sits right at the very core of biology, something to chew on.